Welcome to the Anniston Museums and Gardens. I'm Amy Gray, Education Director. The Berman Museum is celebrating a huge milestone this month, 25 years of operation. Before the museum opened its doors, there was a vision to enrich our community from two extraordinary Anniston collectors, Farley and Germaine Berman. During this 5-part video series, we explore the Bermans' unique collection and learn about the mysterious lives of our founders. Farley Berman was born in Anniston, Alabama on September 9, 1910 to Jacob and Etta Berman. Farley suggested that his collecting began at the age of 6. Farley stated, "I started with a little .22 caliber rifle. One thing led to another, and I ended up with the collection I have today." He attended the University of Alabama and Emory University, graduating in 1934 with a law degree. While practicing law in Atlanta, Berman joined the Army Reserve in 1937 and enlisted full-time in 1941 after Pearl Harbor. Germaine King, a French national, was born in Paris on September 15, 1908. Following the Nazi invasion of France, Germaine joined Free France's intelligence agency and was inserted into French colonial North Africa. And that's where their story began. During World War II, Colonel Berman was stationed in North Africa, while Germaine was a French national and a member of the French intelligence. As Berman later recalled, "I was spying on her and she was spying on me."
Farley and Germaine, from my understanding, were in North Africa. And there was a leak of information. And no one could find out where this information was coming from. They knew that there was a German double agent somewhere in the mix. So Farley was spying on Germaine to see if she was the double agent. Germaine was spying on Farley to see if he was the double agent. Neither of them, by the way, were the double agent.
They were married in 1948 and returned to Anniston, Farley's hometown, to make their home and where they would live for the remainder of their lives. To learn more about Farley and Germaine, we're going to hear from several people who knew them well. Your friendship with them.
Well, it was an honor to know them because they were such gracious people, you know. And I used to work at the Anniston Army Depot, and Mr. Berman, he loved, and Ms. Berman, they loved talking and showing off their collection. And when Fort McClellan closed, we were the only military installation, so we didn't get as many visitors. We used to get visitors from both sides. And he'd welcome those into his home. And so when Fort McClellan closed, we were his source, primary military type visitors. And I remember he'd call me up sometimes and say, "Look, you're not using me. You gotta come visit me. I want to show my collection." And so he'd show it, and they were so gracious. I mean, he had it in his home, in the basement, the upstairs of his home. He had a lot of the art collections and a lot of bronzes and so forth. But downstairs in his basement areas, where he had most all of his weapons and all the types of weapons that you have in the museum now, the espionage types and all of them. And he'd invite people in, he'd introduce himself and his wife, and then they would take us on a tour. And he would, Ms. Berman would actually load little blanks in certain weapons. And so as he was going through his tour, he would show the weapons. Some of them he'd just reach back and he'd fire it. And what was so comical is Miss Berman was the one that loaded the weapons, and she knew which one was going to fire, but she'd still get scared every time it went off.
Now, did he know which ones were going to?
No, he didn't know. She didn't know it, and he'd sort of click every one of them. And he was, and about midway through the tour, used to last about an hour and a half, or 2 hours. About halfway through it, he'd tell everybody, "Okay, get a glass of wine, cheese, and so forth." He'd have refreshments for us and so forth. And then he would show a little closet he had in his basement area. It was just packed with weapons. He didn't have room to display them, but his basement was big, and he was just, just remarkable to go through it. And I went through his home, I don't know how many times, and it was just every time. And my wife, she would go. We'd have, we'd usually get husband and wives to take the people in, the visitors, and it was just fascinating to go through it every time I went through it.
So,
Wow.
And Colonel and Miss Berman became dental patients right away. And so before I was even aware of the collection, I knew Colonel and Mrs. Berman as dental patients. Being of that generation, they always needed restorative work. And They were really cool, interesting people.
And she was animated and could always have something funny to say when he's showing you the collection. She'd always have some, little funny thing to make of it. But she shared not only his interest, but I think his ability, because they sort of shop together. They'd go on these trips, and he didn't go by himself. Germaine was always with him to pick out weaponry or whatever else it was that they were collecting. So she was very knowledgeable, and where her knowledge came from, I don't know. But I don't know how she knew some of the things she knew. But she was, she was cute. She was a little bit of a thing.
And we're grateful for the Bermans
Yes.
for bringing it to us.
Yes.
Colonel Berman not only collected weapons and artifacts, he also collected Rolls Royces at one time. It was unusual to drive by his house and see a half a dozen Rolls Royces parked in his driveway. But he did, and he owned a fabric store in downtown. I would leave my office and drive down typically an alley in order to go to the courthouse. And here's a Rolls Royce parked behind his fabric store in an alley. You don't see many Rolls Royces parked in an alley. Anyway, I'm off the subject. The story that I recall is that Colonel Berman was in England on one occasion to attend some kind of, I'm sure, firearms sale or display. And he met a gentleman there who, in speaking with him, disclosed the fact that he owned a Rolls Royce. It had some historical significance that I recall. And Colonel Berman asked him about maybe purchasing that automobile. And as the story goes, the man said there's not enough money in all England, on the whole island, to buy that automobile. So the subject was dropped, and the two men talked further. And as it turned out, Colonel Berman owned a particular firearm that this man in England felt like he should have. So he asked Colonel Berman about purchasing that firearm, to which Farley said, I am told there's not enough money on the whole island to buy that firearm. So they finally solved the problem by trading the Rolls Royce for the firearm. And to me, that illustrates not only Colonel Berman's financial stature at the time, but his ability to work a trade. He was a smart man, and he was generous to a fault.
I lived in the neighborhood, several blocks from Farley, and Farley was a mysterious fellow, and my kindergarten was just a couple of houses up from him, so passed it daily, and we were always told, oh, that's Mr. Berman's house, you don't go on that property, because there was mystery surrounding Mr. Berman's house, which as a 5-6-year-old I didn't fully understand, but we understood that there was something valuable in there, and later, found out what it was.
So what was your first impression of Colonel Berman when you went to his home? That was the first time you had met him?
I had met him in passing just before, my first real conversation in his home. I thought he was just, and I'd known a few like this in the past, one more eccentric old retired soldier. Not being critical, but you've seen them, and they say a number of us who are a few years past retirement, we get a little eccentric and unusual, and that's okay. We all have our ways, and I thought, well, this will be fascinating, we'll all be nice and polite. And the man was articulate, knowledgeable beyond imagination. If he made up stories, no one would have known because they were so well developed and so factual in presentation. So yes, I just thought he was rather strange. At the end, I thought, I wish this man would live another 20 years because he knows so much, and I don't think the world knows enough about what's going on.
Yeah, it'd be great just to sit down and...
Oh,
just ask him lots of questions and just listen. Now, was that the first time that you had met Mr. Berman, or had you met him prior to that time?
Only once before.
Okay.
You know, and I was very young,
Okay.
and I was selling magazines.
Uh-huh.
I think I've tried to recall since I knew I was going to do this interview. I believe I was still in elementary school, but it may have been my first year of junior high.
Okay.
And I was just out knocking on doors. I lived on Johnston Drive, and Champaign was a couple of streets away. And so I was out knocking on doors, and Mr. Berman invited me in. And I believe he bought at least 8 subscriptions to magazines.
Okay.
Oh, you know,
Very supportive.
Oh yeah, it just really made my effort, and you know, so I was endeared to him from that time.
He was really in his element when he was sharing his collection with not only military personnel but children.
And he loved the look on their face when he would show them a gun, and then all of a sudden the gun would do something terribly unusual, and he just loved to see the reaction
I
that
bet.
the kids had to that.
Stories is what makes history come alive.
It's real.
It's
not,
real,
It's not
exactly.
then. It's
Mhm.
here. It's now. It's so-and-so knew them. I knew of them. I remember somebody talking about them.
Yes.
I remember the first story I ever heard about Colonel Berman, and I thought, well, fascinating, eccentric old soldier. And I'm not sure how much of this is apocryphal, but perhaps Colonel Berman and Mrs. Berman would have appreciated it that way. That they were a rather elegant couple, but as the photograph shows, there he is, wearing a helmet, kind of incorrect uniform, I won't pick it apart. World War II uniforms varied from theater to theater, and he's wearing captain bars on his helmet. I understand, even though he retired as Colonel Berman, most of the time during the Second War, he wore the insignia of a captain, and either wore Ordnance Corps, bullets, bombs, fixing equipment, and testing equipment, testing and development, or military intelligence insignia. And it was insignia of convenience for him. Depending upon what he was doing, his role, he would change it. And he had interesting assignments. I understand, I don't know this for a fact, that he was detailed, branch detailed as the Army would sometimes call it, to special activities of intelligence, and those were in the days when the predecessor, the precursor of the Central Intelligence Agency, the OSS, was being developed. And word was that he worked with them, whatever that means, whatever the details were. But at the same time, he was working in military intelligence. Well, maybe that makes sense. If he's with the CIA's predecessor, the OSS, he would be involved in intelligence. But he was also involved, he wore the Ordnance Corps, testing and development of military equipment and weaponry. Geez, could that have any relationship with how so many Second World War and previous war weaponry happened to find its way here to the Berman, because here's someone who actually understood it, appreciated it, had access to it, however the rest of it unfolded.
Right.
So, I being a former soldier, and he being a soldier, I find his time in uniform much more colorful and exciting than mine. I loved my time in uniform. I loved my 2 years on Anniston Army Depot. Best 2 years I had in my military career. Best time in uniform. But Colonel Berman just knocked it out of the park in variety and doing things that were exciting, but perhaps great for the nation, and certainly wonderful for our Berman Museum and our community.
Sounds like she knew how to handle him.
She did. She knew how to handle him. And she was always very gracious when anybody was there. And he was showing the collection. She was extremely gracious about bringing you something. If you were just seeing it, not staying for dinner, but I mean, you know, I'll bring you a cold drink or some little something to nibble on. She made you feel very much at home, even to people who she really didn't know particularly, but she was a very gracious hostess.
Germain shared his passion for collecting. He collected rare weapons, and she collected works of fine art.
And I think it's so interesting that they met each other over there, but that she had, I guess, working with the underground, she had knowledge of weaponry and that sort of thing. That you meet someone you fall in love with, it happens, to have something, and you have something in common, but you don't usually have weapons in common.
Right.
And so she was able to share his interest in that sort of thing. And like I said, some expertise too, because she went on trips with him.
Mm-hmm.
He had 2 large German Shepherd dogs that would spend the night in the basement with the collection. And whenever you came over, the first few minutes of each visit was staying upstairs, twiddling your thumbs while he and Ms. Berman tried to get those dogs outside, because they were trained to, if anybody they didn't know was in the basement, hold him until the police came. So you had to wait upstairs, fiddling around while they got the dogs outside.
Turned off their security system, so to speak.
It was always fascinating.
I remember the first time I met him, he loved to come out to membership receptions. And at the time, the auditorium here at the Berman was a theater style. The chairs went down, and there was a high stage. He was a character, and he loved to get up on that stage and entertain with his collection. So the first time I came to one of those, Berman Museum, it was before we were a united, 2 museums united. They had invited museum staff to come over. So there was a good many of us, and I remember the curator of education at that time, his wife came, and we were all sitting back here. And so he would bring out the combination and the spy weapons, and he would talk about them. You never knew if he was telling the truth or making something up, but he would talk about them, share about them, and then he would pull the trigger and he'd go bang, like that. He was so much fun. So, but what we didn't know, that eventually when he would pull that trigger, he had a blank in it, and it was, in that auditorium, it is so loud.
Yes.
Well, our curator's wife was sitting right beside me, and she had a drink in her hand, and she threw it up in the air. It went forever. And Colonel Berman thought that was hilarious. That made his night.
Right.
He just thought it was hilarious. So I did join one tour here. I never had the opportunity to go to his home before the collection here. I did join one tour that he did of the collection and museum. And at the time, I didn't have a cell phone that you just pull out and video. I wish I had. It was interesting.
Oh, I bet.
To follow him around and hear all of his information. And like I say, was it real or was it not real? You never knew.
He had a real eye for precious metals, for antique things. And after they were married, they went to Europe a lot
on vacation.
On vacation and to look for things. But he could go in a sort of nothing store and spot right away something that was going to be valuable. Maybe the owner didn't know how valuable it was, but he could buy it for practically nothing. And then, but the fact that he gave it all to this community.
Yes. What are some of your favorite stories from that, and your favorite artifact?
As a dental patient, Colonel and Mrs. Berman would come have work done, and they'd run up a bill, and they'd let the bill sit there, and it was okay. And then some afternoon he'd call and say, "David, you need to come by the house." And I learned early on that what he was going to do would be offer me one of the bronzes from his collection or offer me one of the paintings from his collection. Not usually a weapon, but he had artwork that he'd collected. Whenever he got a new, better casting of a particular bronze, he would use that Renoir or that Remington to pay me for a dental bill. And it was just kind of the way that it happened, and we all played along and acted like it was a thing of great value. In Anniston in the 80s and 90s, whenever you went to some other physician's home for a party or for something, and you saw pieces of artwork in his home, you'd say, "Oh, I see you're Colonel Berman's your patient too." And they just laughed because in the 80s and 90s, Colonel Berman's artifacts were kind of a currency in town to pay bills with and stuff like that. But it's helped our collection, and we're proud to have the things.
Farley would put on a chauffeur's cap.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know that story?
I've heard one, yeah.
Yeah, and
You'll
then he
share
would-
that with us.
Because there were so many generals and things like that that came to Fort McClellan and the North Depot. Farley take the Rolls Royce, put his
So they wouldn't know that who he was?
I guess they didn't. I don't know. He probably later told him he was a colonel in the Secret Service.
Right.
But he'd go down and pick him up and drive him around out Fort McClellan and his Rolls Royce.
Right. The Bermans regularly shared their treasures for those who were interested through tours of their home. As being, you mentioned that your husband was part of
Yes.
the Berman and the foundation from the beginning.
Right.
When did you meet? Have you met Mr. and Mrs. Berman,
Yes.
Colonel and Mrs. Berman? When did you meet them?
It was probably when my children were quite small. They're quite old now. But we went over to the Berman's home, and it was just an amazing sight to behold, because he had so much knowledge of his collection, and he showed us the various things, his art, his guns, his weaponry. It was really a magical place, and it made for a wonderful tour just through his home, and it was really packed. It was, there was no extra floor space. He really had a fine collection over there, including his Rolls Royces. Which, of course, is not part of the Berman collection, but that was one thing he was known for around town.
One of the first things we did as the new Anniston City Council was tour Farley's home on Champaign Avenue. And as I recall, it was the first week of November. We had just taken office. And Mr. Berman put on a great show for us. And I was so impressed with the quantity and the quality of what he possessed, and really his sincere desire to share it with others. When I left there, I told Tom, whatever we have to do, we're going to do to make sure this museum is built in Anniston. And so we were able to accomplish that.
But I did not come to the museum right away. I went to the Berman home. We had visitors to Anniston Army Depot at the time. I'm a former commander of the depot, and as part of the visit, we thought we should have an educational tour. And Colonel Berman was kind enough and enthused to have us to the home. Now, subsequent to that, other visitors would come here to the museum itself, and we got to see the different displays and him not really firing rounds at those of us in the audience, and scared the et ceteras out of everyone. And that was fascinating. But going to the home was something I couldn't have even guessed or imagined. We went down to what was apparently the basement. And I thought, one more basement in Anniston, Alabama, what will this be like? And it was a museum unto itself.
So he still had pieces there in the basement.
Gracious, yes.
Okay.
So much of it, not only from earlier times, and we're talking 19th century earlier, but so many things from Europe during and after the Second World War, or before, during, and after the Second World War, to include some just fascinating artifacts from Nazi Germany.
Although several museums and institutions expressed interest in the Berman collection, Farley and Germain ultimately chose to leave it to their hometown of Anniston, with the wish that others could learn the significance of the objects from a historic perspective. Farley said Germain had two loves, Paris and Anniston. Paris has the Louvre and doesn't need any more museums. Together they collected and preserved hundreds of historical artifacts and works of art.
Make sure we take care of that, because it was so dear to him. And a lot of people don't realize this. Initially, he was going to donate this whole collection of his to the Army, and just give it to the Army. we had several general officers that were familiar with it. They were trying to get it accepted by the Army, but they couldn't guarantee him that his collection would stay intact. It would be maintained together. And because of that, he sort of withdrew his offer. And we ended up, fortunately, they didn't take it. Fortunately, we've got now the Berman Museum.
But Mr. Berman was such a outstanding citizen, and he was such a great ambassador for the city. And often visitors, dignitaries that came to Anniston, Farley's home was one of the things you just had to do while you were in Anniston. And the fact now that everybody in the world can enjoy this, there's no excuse not to do it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Love the guy. Glad he settled here.
Yes.
Glad I settled here.
Yes. And we keep hearing over and over how important it was for him, or to him, that this collection remain in Anniston.
Yes.
He definitely wanted it to stay in his community.
Well, I think that's so key. And I think those of us who are affiliated with the Berman Museum Foundation as board members have a sense of place and self. And a number of us have traveled a lot. We've spent more than a number of days in the Smithsonian complex, and we've been to the British Museum in London and this museum in Germany and You just add them up wherever. But here we are in the middle of America. Not only is it unique, but it's not unique in that it means there are just a few pieces or a few presentations or little vignettes of history. There are many of them. There are whole chunks of history. There are understandings.
And throughout history, like you said, it's not just one time period.
Yes.
But it covers such a broad range of time.
Yes, I recall one, and I was glad to be part of the tour. Having been through a number of times, I was asked, do I want to go through the tour after our little social? I said, sure, I want to go through. I wanted to talk with a couple of the folks, but I wanted to point out some things. One of the senior people on the tour, I didn't know, was a collector of American post-Civil War, this is an incorrect term, Wild West weaponry and memorabilia. He loved the era of post-Civil War, pre-Spanish American War, the late 19th century America. He understood and had fired certain of the weapons that were here in our displays, but I thought I remember him saying only one was real, the rest were replicas. And here he was actually seeing the ones that he had gone to different places and thought he was pleased and proud to be part of that. And he was taken back in history to see it. And as he said, why would this be in Anniston, Alabama? And we just said,
A very common question.
a very interesting old soldier who fell in love with the community.
Next week, join us as we learn about the Berman Museum's development years and how the Berman legacy lives on.